Please welcome Brent Forrester.
Thank you, Mark. Those credentials make it sound like I have some kind of intrinsic talent. My great message to you tonight is that I don't. That I am a person of, I think, sub-average talents, honestly, when it comes to writing half-hour comedy, and considerable disadvantages, which I overcame through a certain amount of hard work, definite luck, and listening well to a lot of good mentors in TV. And my sincere goal for all of you tonight, I know that there are so many aspiring TV writers, and what I want to do is tell you my story and share the big lessons of writing half-hour TV comedy with you as they came up for me. So let's start with the thing that puzzles so many people who are trying to become professional television writers, which is breaking in. So let me tell you the story of my breaking into the TV industry. Let's just start back in Forrester prehistory. My parents were strange people who didn't fit in well with society. They were doctors, but kind of antisocial. And people like that in the 70s would sometimes buy land in West Malibu, not to be confused with like Colony Malibu where it's fancy. This is like remote Nowheresville beyond Point Doom. And I grew up there, and my mom was one of these people who just did not like television. And so she refused to have a television in the home. As a result, I did not watch TV at all growing up. And if any of you did, there's your first giant advantage over me. I had no experience of television. I was a reader of books and magazines, and I liked short stories a little bit, and I entered a short story contest in like 8th grade. I won $50 and became kind of a short story hobbyist. And that's really all I had. I don't even know if I was very good at short stories. It's just nobody else was doing them. And I carried that sort of feeling of maybe I have some advantage in a thing through college, where I learned very little and developed no talents. I graduated, thought I've got to make a living. I have this thing, short story writing. Are there jobs that involve writing? I would have done any job that paid and involved writing, including journalism and soap opera writing, where I took a class in soap opera writing, and I would have done that as a career. I was not funny by reputation, and like I say, I hadn't watched TV. But I had, as it turned out, no connections anywhere except one in half-hour TV comedy. And my connection was the mom of a guy I went to high school with. And this woman, her name was Susan Harris. She was born Susan Spivak, a Jewish woman from the East Coast who had come to Los Angeles and at 25 years old was working as a secretary at MGM. She married a character actor named Berkeley Harris, who got her pregnant and then dumped her for a soap opera actress and ran off to New York. And Susan Harris found herself pregnant and scared about making a living. She was a secretary at MGM where they had TV shows, and she dared to try writing a spec script, and it turned out she wasn't bad. They gave her a job on a show called Love American Style, and that was how she broke in. And she learned the business a bit, created a show called Soap, wrote every single episode of Soap for 2 seasons, then created the Golden Girls in the height of TV gold rush times for the sitcom, sold the Golden Girls for $80 million. She and her son were then unfathomably rich while Berkeley Harris died of lung cancer in New York. and then I met this guy in high school, so I graduated from college, and I said to my friend, can I talk to your mom about getting a job in half-hour comedy? And she was nice enough to talk to me on the phone. She said, the way we do it is you write a fake episode, it's called a spec, and then you hope somebody reads it and likes it enough to give you a job. So just watch some TV show and try to imitate it, and that is what I did. The show that I chose to imitate was Murphy Brown. which we kind of remember fondly, Murphy Brown. I'm not so sure it was that great a show in every episode. I think there was kind of a formula for the jokes where you would sort of like mention a politician that was famous and then combine it with something kind of trivial, and that would be the joke. So a typical Murphy Brown joke would be, sorry I'm late, I was getting chimichangas with Bob Dole. And then last night I was playing Parcheesi with Geraldine Ferraro. And that was the whole pattern of Murphy Brown. That was what I wrote. I gave it to Susan Harris. Now, those of you who are writers may relate to the following moment. Gave my first spec script to a professional writer. Kind of thought I just hit it out of the park. It's like, I know they say you have to write quite a few, but I think maybe this guy nailed it. And the phone did not ring on the first day after I'd given it to her, nor the next day, which kind of surprised me because I thought this thing's really going to open her eyes. And the days went on, still no call. 2 weeks went by. Every time the phone rang, I thought, that's probably Susan Harris telling me that my script is great. And finally, after 2 weeks, the phone rang. Hello, Brent, it's Susan. I've read half your script. At which point I still believed because it was so good, she didn't have to read the other half. No, it was terrible. It was a terrible spec script. She was kind enough to read it. And she gave me at that point the first great piece of advice that I ever got in TV. Some of you have notepads. I don't think you need to overnote this, but write this down because it's the best piece of advice I ever got. Susan Harris said, Brent, I've read half your script. Here's the thing. 1, silly isn't funny. Now that is not always true. Sometimes in sketch silly is funny, sometimes in a cartoon silly is funny, but for the most part in half-hour comedy, you have to go deeper than silly. I did not know that. She said, write the way people talk. Again, this was alien to me. I was contriving lines the way I'd sort of seen them contrived on TV. It wasn't the way to success, and it wasn't how Susan herself had done it. She said, the secret of writing half-hour comedy is go after what's difficult for you, maybe even painful, and trust that it will come out funny. And that was the slam dunk piece of wisdom that took me from a guy who knew nothing about what I was doing to a guy who could get there. What I did at that point was I spent a year just writing more specs because I knew that Susan would probably, if she read me at all, read me only one more time. And I didn't want to blow that opportunity. Wrote probably 4 or 5 specs until finally I thought, I think I have one. I wrote a spec Blossom. For those who remember this show, it was not a show about anything that was obviously in my world. It was about a teenage girl in high school. And it featured, however, a brother character, and I had a brother, and I was struggling a little bit emotionally in my relationship to my brother. We were living in the same kind of crummy house to save rent, and I was ambitious and he wasn't, and it bothered me. I was worried for him. And I managed to write a Blossom about that. The episode involved Blossom's brother coming to work in the cafeteria, and Blossom's embarrassed for him. Even as I say it now, I can feel a certain emotionality. That was feelable in the script when I wrote the Blossom. And that sense that there's an author underneath there trying to communicate something emotional to you, I believe is the key to a spec that moves people. In any case, it worked on Susan Harris, and she gave me my first job in television on a show called Nurses on NBC. So I entered the world of television actually at the end of the peak of the sitcom on TV in terms of its economic viability. As it turns out, when I joined Nurses, there were 20 sitcoms in the top 30 shows on TV, believe it or not. That's how much this form had metastasized. And that expansion of the form, it was cheap and it got ratings at that time. That expansion actually created what we think of as the demise of the sitcom in some people's opinion, because basically what happened was the talent pool just got too diffuse. People just couldn't create good shows at that volume, was part of the problem. what is undeniable is I became a writer on a pretty bad show. Nurses, if you ever see it, the comic stars of the show, one of them is Jeff Altman, God bless him. He was a weird comedian whose whole act was just a series of incoherent catchphrases. Like, he would pull up his pants and he'd say, "I'll flip you like a flapjack. You're a butt steak." There was no content, he had no POV. And he was the comic star of the show. It was weird, but there were still good writers on the show. Old-time writers, a guy from Newhart, Billy Van Zandt. He sort of talked out of the side of his mouth. Van Zandt, see, it's Van Zandt and Milmore. Van Zandt and Milmore were this institution at that time. She was an actress, and he had started writing for Broadway. They had wisdom and insight to share. The first thing that I learned that is useful for you is just the way television was written in the sort of factory form. When you're writing scripts at a factory pace, which is what any TV show is, there's a form that you use, and a form that they had picked up from an earlier era of TV. It was basically this. We're going to take 3x5 cards and put them on the wall, and we're going to have 3 different colors for the A, B, and C story, and that's how we're going to map out the story. Then a writer is going to go and write a first draft. Then we're going to punch up that draft. We're going to do a table read, punch it up again. Now we shoot it. And that's basically the old-timey factory system of making sitcoms that we basically still use today. So I was introduced to that. I was also probably, even without me knowing it, kind of despised by the other writers because they were veterans and I was just a nobody who Susan Harris had put on their show without any still discernible talent. I did something that I recommend for anybody who's young and eager and trying to break into the business, which was I decided to make a big show of my work ethic, which at that time I could afford to do. I had nothing else going on in my life. What that meant was I just arrived earlier than everybody and left later than them, quite demonstrably. And it finally peaked in me sleeping in the office one night. Just slept in the office. And the next day, I kind of let it be known sort of that I'd slept in the office, and the rumor got around that I'd slept in the office, and people came to me, "Did you sleep in the office last night?" I said, "Yeah, I slept in the office." "Why? Why did you sleep in the office?" I said, "I was writing stuff, jokes, story stuff we might be able to use. I don't know. I just wanted to keep generating some stuff. Here it is." And that was the breakthrough where they turned and they just said, "You know what? Maybe this guy is a nobody, loser, whatever. We hate him. But he's killing himself. Let's give him something." And they did. They shared some wisdom with me. I'll share the biggest piece of wisdom that I got from nurses. Got this from a guy named Bruce Ferber, who had worked on Bosom Buddies with Tom Hanks and Peter Scolari. Bruce went on to write and run the show Coach and was a very good writer, I thought. Bruce said to me, "I'm going to tell you the secret of writing stories." And then he brought me in his office and he closed the door because this was how important this little simple thing was to him and he didn't want it to get out. He said, "A story is usually about 2 people." That was it. Believe it or not, that oddly simple insight was something I have carried with me through my whole career. Whenever we had to generate stories on King of the Hill, that's how we would do it. Who's in the story? Is it Bobby and Hank, or is it Bobby and Peggy? Actually, let's do a Hank and Peggy. We haven't done that in a while. And that would be the core of every story that we generated. This one versus this one in a struggle is the A story. And these 2 is the B, and these 2 is the C if you do a C story. And Bruce was the first guy to ever point that out to me. It's very useful when you start getting more into the complexity of story to remember that simplicity of arc as the core. Okay. Nurses, I had a term writing contract. Now, a term writer is a contractual means by which I can pay you less than a staff writer. What I say is I'm hiring you to write a script, but over a fairly long term. So I'm just paying you for the script, and the term is long enough that your weekly salary is actually less than a staff writer. It's a way to get a little bit of a bargain on a writer. But the thing is, I had a finite term, and my term ended, and I just didn't want to rock the boat. I thought, I am in. I don't want to get kicked out by asking for money, so I just didn't say anything. And I continued to work for 4 or 5 months on that show, unpaid, just eating the free lunch and trying to make sure nobody found out that I wasn't employed there. By the end of the period, I was able to get jokes in the show, and the other writers who knew that I was not getting money would say, "You should do something here. This is not fair. You can't work for free. And I said, please don't rock the boat. Even so, even though I wasn't being paid, at the end of a 5-month period, the company, Witt Thomas Harris, decided that they had another show, Good and Evil, was getting canceled. They loved the writers on Good and Evil. Let's just get rid of all the nurses writers and put the Good and Evil writers on that staff. And so the entire staff of nurses was fired, including me, even though I wasn't being paid. So it was a sort of a brush out the door. Here's what I discovered, unfortunately for me at that time. I thought that I had broken into TV, but in fact, what happened was I had almost broken out of it, because an unknown commodity might be very talented and a great writer, but a commodity, a person who has been fired from a bad show, cannot get in the door, is what I discovered most places, at least at that time. UTA is where I'm represented now. UTA on 6 separate occasions managed to reject me. It was incredible that I got in the door 6 different times in the course of a year. What would happen is I would meet someone who was a good writer and employed at UTA, impress them enough that they would say, yeah, I'll get you a meeting with my agent. I would get the meeting with the agent, and they'd say, no, we don't want to pick you up. You were fired from nurses, right? And then somehow I'd meet somebody else who was at UTA, and they would get me a meeting with a different agent here, and I'd come in, and after a while they'd be like, you again? What are you doing here? Get out! We've met you 5 times in 6. I got the last laugh. Here I am, paying them 10% of my salary. But you know, agents don't want to pick up people who don't already have jobs. It's one of the great catch-22s. Is when you get a job, then they're happy to take you on. And that's what I had to do. I had to break in a second time, essentially. So, post-nurses, I'm unemployed for over a year, trying to get meetings with agents. It's not going very well. It was very demoralizing and very depressing for me at the time, because I just couldn't figure out what the next move was. But I didn't give up, and I did keep writing, and I kept analyzing comedy. I went into a pretty heavy analytic period at that time. What I would do is watch Roseanne, in particular. It was my favorite show on TV, and I think a very good show, and other shows as well. And anytime a joke made me laugh, I would write down the joke, and then I would try to analyze what it was about that joke that made me laugh. And so with shows like Roseanne, one of the first things that I discovered was frequently the joke form is setup, punchline, divided between 2 people. So this person will do the setup line, and this person will do the punchline. As soon as you identify that, you begin to see further complexities in the form. So, one thing I noticed very often would make me laugh, was a laugh magnifier, was an element of surprise within the joke. So how do you get surprise into a setup, punchline form? Well, there are many ways, is what I discovered. Let me share just one of them with you. If this character does a setup, and this character does a punchline, but this punchline is the setup for another punchline by the first character, I've disguised the setup. When you heard this punchline delivered, you just heard it as a punchline. And then, surprise, wait, it was the setup for a second punchline. I noticed over and over again on Roseanne, that form would get me the big laugh, and it was an element of surprise. There were all kinds of other tricks that I found you could take from simply watching and analyzing the show. There was a whole species of gag where a person's on the phone. You hear the person on the phone, but you don't hear the other person. And so you have an assumption of what's being said, and then the joke is a surprise that you were wrong about that. And there were all kinds of forms like that that I found. What I did then was write a Roseanne, which was essentially a showcase of the tricks that I had learned. As you read it, it was just that thing Brent learned, that thing Brent learned, that thing Brent learned, and it read very well. This is a point that is important to dwell on as you try to break into TV. We tend to obsess a little bit on the connection. Who is going to read me? Can I get read by this person? Well, my experience is that over time you can get read by people because people remember being read and they want to pay back and they will read you once, maybe twice. Frequently those connections can be found over and over again. The question is what happens when the person reads it. And I think it is very important to remember. It's not just about carrying a football down the field, but the quality of the football itself. Your football is your spec script. And try to remember to, at least in your first 5 to 10 pages, put a little something special in it, because when you get read, it's going to matter. And my Roseanne was a vindication of that. My second breaking in was just on the basis of this script. What happened was, I became friends with a young writer at that time, a fantastic writer named Maya Forbes. She had graduated from college. She was half African American, as I recall. Brilliant, hilarious. CAA picked her up, and she had a hot streak almost out the gate. Staffing season, multiple shows wanted her. Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, a new show called The Larry Sanders Show, and then this unknown weird thing called The Ben Stiller Show, which had been created, the pilot, by two college dropouts, Ben Stiller and Judd Apatow, both in their early to mid-20s. Maya Forbes met on each of the shows, said no to the Fresh Prince, yes to Larry Sanders, no to Ben Stiller, but the Ben Stiller guys, Judd and Ben, said to her, okay, cool, Maya, go with Larry, but who do you know? Have you read any scripts out there? Anything good? Anybody that we should look at? She said, yeah, take a look at Forrester's Roseanne. This guy's got a good Roseanne. So they got a copy, they read it. I got a phone call from Judd who said, hey, we just read your script. We think it's good, but we're a sketch show, so can you send over your sketch packet? And I said, of course, yeah. I'll get that to you Friday. And then I went to Blockbuster Video, rented all the Saturday Night Lives, and tried to figure out what is a sketch and how does it work. Again, in this case, the analytical really paid off because watching sketches, I quickly discovered a structure which was the structure I used for the Ben Stiller Show the entire time. The structure was premise, escalation, escalation, twist. That was the form that I could see there. What does that mean specifically? I'm trying to think of the sketch that I wrote that got me the job. As I recall, it was a guy walks into a fast food restaurant and he wants to buy some food, and he says, I'll have a cheeseburger, a soda, large fries. And the guy behind the counter says, so you want the biggie fries? And he says, yeah, and a hamburger and a Coke. Oh, so then you do want the biggie fries? I do. Then say it. Say biggie fries. So that was the premise. The guy wants another guy to say an absurd name of a fast food thing in order to buy it. That's it. That's all the premise is. So how do we escalate it? As I recall, the escalations had to do with other items of food that he's trying to buy. And then the twist was simply that you push in on a sign that says Employee of the Month. Not a huge twist, but it felt like an ending. That structure was what I would use at the Ben Stiller Show when I got hired, which is what happened. I was able to create a sketch packet that was good enough to get me hired without ever having written a sketch, simply by analyzing. So the next chapter for me was the Ben Stiller Show. In terms of writing half-hour comedy, which I really think is the focus for me and probably for most of you, there are fewer lessons on the Ben Stiller Show, but I think there are some things to be learned just by looking at the personalities of that show. The thing that really strikes me looking back at that show is that there were so many people who felt like taste makers on the show. Judd Apatow is just a taste maker. Ben Stiller is that. What does that mean? To me, it means somebody who, when you talk to them about comedy, they have very strong opinions about it. They absolutely know that they're right, and people around them have that sense as well. Like, if that person thinks it's funny, it's funny. Judd was that way, Ben was that way. Janine Garofalo, if Janine Garofalo thought your thing was funny, you just knew it was funny. She didn't laugh at a lot of stuff, but she did laugh at some stuff and had a great laugh, and you just said, that's it. It was a devotion, I think, to the art of comedy. You notice also all those characters were performers. Judd himself was a performer. Ben was a performer. Janine, Bob Odenkirk, David Cross, who came on. Also a tastemaker who came from performance. Janine and David Cross in particular, if you look at them, they had a rebel outsider vibe to them, which kind of added a certain integrity to their taste, which I think is worth noting. Frequently in comedy, a sense of I don't give a damn whether I succeed financially in this, I just believe in the quality of this message is compelling in comedy, and people like that definitely had it. David Cross, who came on as a writer late in the show, also had another quality that I think is useful if you can develop it, rare, but common in superstars of the entertainment industry, and that quality was just, I don't give a shit what you think, courage. Let me give you an example. I had been writing on the Ben Stiller show for, I don't know, several months when David Cross was brought in. He was a friend of Janine Garofalo's, a comedian, and they told me that I was going to share an office with this guy. So you can imagine if you had an office and you were typing away there alone, and then they brought in somebody else into your office, you might feel like this was my office, and now who's this guy typing away also in my office? And so I probably projected a certain degree of chilliness to this young David Cross who'd been brought in. The first day of working together, I'm sitting at my desk, and I notice Dave is no longer at his desk. He's gone to the window, and he just has his fingertips pressed against it. And he's quietly singing. And what he was singing was this. When will he know me as I truly am? I'm just a person with feelings like him. It was just crazy and hilarious and totally called out the dynamic that was there between us with utter Dave Cross fearlessness. And I find that attitude towards fear is a really useful one for anyone who works in the business. It's something I think about a lot now in TV production, which can often be frightening because TV production is a lot of money at stake and a lot of time pressure and a lot of subjectivity, and it gets weird and scary. And sometimes I feel like, just be David Cross, dude, and just fucking go balls out. And it often works in a leadership position. The guy who was most influential to me at the Ben Stiller show was Bob Odenkirk. Bob Odenkirk, some of you may know this guy now as Saul from Better Call Saul. He's a tremendous comic performer now. But what he was on the Ben Stiller show was our head writer, essentially. Bob was already, when he came onto that show, acknowledged to be one of the great minds of sketch comedy, one of the great living sketch comedy writers, though he was scarcely 30 when he joined that show. What Bob had was an encyclopedic knowledge of all sketch comedy that had ever been done, it seemed. A high priority on well-crafted structure and also originality, which seemed to be the highest premium of all. If you could write a sketch that was well-structured and original, then Bob would approve of it, but how were you going to do that when there was so much sketch that had preceded you? Well, in this case for me, I felt very intimidated. I'm in there with these tastemakers, and I've kind of lucked in, really, at this point. But what I did have that worked to my advantage was I had a comfort with trial and error. And this, again, is one of the great tools of comedy writing. We assume when somebody is funny that they're just funny all the time. They're not. No one is. The best comedy writers that I work with might be funny 25% of the time when trying to pitch a punchline. Who knows? Maybe they have a hot streak and they're 60% sometime. Nobody's 100%. If you get comfortable with trial and error, you have this tremendous advantage. You do what I did on the Ben Stiller show. I would just write down a bunch of sketch ideas, premises that I had thought of, and walk them into Bob Odenkirk's office. I'd say, Bob, here's my first one. Substitute torturer. The regular torturer is away. I'm your substitute. How can I torture you? Bob says, substitute anything is hacky. Been done, don't do it. Cool. If you're comfortable with that, just go on to the next one, right? The next one, two frat dudes walk into a natural history museum. They walk around and go, whoa, grizzly bear, it's extinct, we kicked its ass, yeah! They high five. Bob's like, that's kind of original, go with that. And that's how I did it. The Ben Stiller show was canceled, quite correctly. It was the lowest rated show on TV at the time, I believe. The ratings only went down to about 200, and we were there. We were up against 60 Minutes, the most popular show on TV. That might have had something to do with it. Fox let us shoot 12, but only air 11 because they wouldn't pay to edit the last one. They were like, this show is a disaster, take it off the air. But the show did have an originality, in part because the creators knew it would be canceled, and so didn't much care what the network said. That would be Judd and Ben defiantly doing what they wanted. And would end up winning a writing Emmy after it was canceled, which is quite remarkable. There was a sort of a delay before that whole Emmy process happened, and so what happened for me initially was, once again, I was out of a job, this time no longer on the Ben Stiller show. What I had, though, at this point was I had Bob Odenkirk. Odenkirk liked my writing. He helped me cull together a sketch packet of what he thought were his favorite sketches that I'd written while I was there. He said, these are good. And then when his friends came calling to say who were the good writers on the Ben Stiller show, he was comfortable sharing my packet. Well, one such writer was Conan O'Brien, recently of The Simpsons. Conan was a Simpsons writer. Conan, as you may know, got sort of discovered as a talk show host and is given his own show. Conan calls around to his funny friends, the great Bob Odenkirk. Who do you know? Take a look at Forrester's sketch packet. Conan calls me, says, I want to hire you for my show. Great, total win for me. I felt very excited. However, the guy running The Simpsons at that time was David Merkin. David Merkin, a very funny, talented guy, and also a shrewd businessman. And David Merkin called Conan and said, who are you looking at over there to hire, Conan? Oh, I got all these people. I got this guy, Forrester. Merkin says, Forrester, eh? Calls my representatives, brings me over, says, how would you like to work for The Simpsons? I hear you're good. I say, sounds good. The show's been on 4 seasons. It's so clearly the greatest show in the history of TV, as far as I can tell. It's crazy that you would hire me. Yes, please. I'll kill myself and sleep in the office if you'll just take me on. He took me on. Suddenly I was a writer on this show. As it would turn out, once again, utterly and completely over my head with a staff of writers, which some have called the greatest staff ever assembled, as a young writer. So let me take you into The Simpsons here, and I'm going to wrap up part 1 of Brent Forrester's TV writing stories with The Simpsons experience, and then if you want, as usual, we'll take question and answer afterwards. Let's take a look at The Simpsons here. Okay, The Simpsons was not just a staff of white men. It was white men from Harvard. It was the least diverse group of writers ever created, right? But having said that, it was an extraordinary group that got assembled in the early days of that show. Not to mention the fact that James Brooks had his fingerprints on the beginning. And James Brooks remains one of the greatest influences for everybody who tries to write half-hour TV. Brooks added that element of emotionality that is key to the success of the show. On top of that, you had these writers of just titanic intelligence. You had guys like John Swartzwelder. Swartzwelder was a guy who he'd started advertising and then had become a writer for the Saturday Night Live staff, and was just this eccentric. He was a very tall guy who apparently had tried out for professional baseball at one time, but now, if you saw him, he looked kind of physically decrepit. His face was florid red. He smoked constantly. When he walked around, he wore a white short-sleeve dress shirt always, with a pack of cigarettes visible in each pocket. And he smoked both of them by the end of a day. You couldn't have him in a writer's room because even when he wasn't smoking, so much smoke reeked off him that your eyes would just water. And so when he would come to meet us, we would meet outside on those days. He had been released from regular staff duties just because of the cigarette smoke, and would come and would be given a story and he'd go off and write it, and through that process he wrote 59 Simpsons episodes, the most of anybody. And he was just truly, I think, some kind of genius who contributed an enormous amount to the style of the show. He had an obsession with old-timey stuff, hobos, Prohibition era things. All of that comes from Swartzwelder in great part. And he was brought into the show by George Meyer, considered by many to be the greatest comedy writer they've ever worked with. George was, again, one of these guys who was so smart. He seemed to just be able to look at epics of history and sort of see where we were, and then realize that he should probably buy huge amounts of gold because of the way history was going. And he did that, by the way, and retired like a zillionaire just on his gold earnings. There was Mike Reese. Mike is indescribably talented as a joke writer. Mike is just, he's a puzzle and game expert who subscribes to all those magazines and just doing puzzles all the time. And then one day he decided he wanted to write a detective story, so he wrote one called Cro-Magnon P.I. and just wins the Edgar Allan Poe Award for Best New Detective Fiction that year. Continues to write children's books with these crazy premises. He was on the staff. Greg Daniels was on the staff. He ends up creating King of the Hill with Mike Judge and The American Office. Greg I often describe as a guy, the candy lemon heads with the character on the head on the front and it's like this? That's the way Greg's brain is. Like if your brain was the size of your head, that's what it would look like. Greg just had tremendous capacity to remember and imagine in complex ways. And then, me, I really didn't belong there at all, and was, again, highly intimidated by the process, because the process was very much a joke writing contest. At The Simpsons, at that time, we would sit in a big room, and David Merkin, the head writer, would pick up the script, and he'd say, go to page 3, we need a new joke for Homer here. And then the room would go into silence for long periods of time, several minutes, while people just racked their brains for some joke that they could say that wouldn't embarrass them in front of these heroes of comedy writing. And it was excruciating, really. I mean, there was a guy on the staff, I don't want to name him, he was a great guy, and I think a talented writer, but he was so afraid of the room that he just didn't pitch at all. And you can't do that. I mean, you're paid to pitch jokes. And he knew that he would be fired, and he was fired after several months, but he just felt better to go out that way than to say something that will make me look like a jackass in front of Mike Reese and George and the rest of them. All right, so my response to this environment was, again, to go back to what had worked for me, which was analysis. If you stick around for Brent Forrester TV writing stories, parts 2, etc., you will see that this is actually a journey out of an analytic process into an intuitive and emotional process of writing. James Brooks is an emotional writer. Judd Apatow is an emotional writer. That's actually the way you're going to want to do it ultimately. But this guy who didn't know that fell back on analysis even at The Simpsons, and as a result, I discovered some things. What I'm about to tell you is in no books. I have searched everywhere for insights on comedy. No one has ever pointed these things out, and here they are. These are the fundamental things that I discovered about joke writing by analyzing Simpsons jokes. When I was hired, I watched every Simpsons episode that had aired. At that point, there were about 100. Wrote down every joke that seemed A+, and analyzed it. Okay, what I discovered was that very often when you see a punchline, it feels like one thing, but there are actually several things going on within it. So let's talk about some of the elements of comedy. The first and most important element of comedy to identify is the contrast between the high and the low. It's actually the Murphy-Brown formula. Okay, if you say I was having chimichangas, the low, with Geraldine Ferraro, important celebrity politician. That's the formula, high-low. The farting preacher. Ever see that video? The farting preacher really makes you laugh. It's this guy giving these sermons, and then they've just overdubbed farts every time he closes his eyes. Preacher, religion, sacred, high, farting, bass, low. One of the most famous scenes in comedy is the clown's funeral on the Mary Tyler Moore Show. Okay, what is sacred? A funeral. What is lowly and profane? A clown. So if all you do is just make a list of things that are sacred and a list of things that are profane and just start making lines between them, you'll see you're creating elements of comedy. What else is sacred? Babies are sacred. What else is profane? Violence is profane. Let's sell a show to Comedy Central tomorrow called Baby with a Machine Gun. Animated, this will be a big hit. That is the first element of comedy to identify as you begin to analyze punchlines. Now, another one that I found very useful when trying to write jokes on The Simpsons was comic irony. Irony is defined different ways by different people. There are different definitions that you can find. I've heard playwrights say there's there's an irony when the text is contradicted by the subtext. That sounds very smart to me. It's not what I'm talking about. Comic irony has a very simple definition for me. In the attempt to achieve something, you achieve the opposite. So concretely, what does that mean? A good example comes from Charlie Chaplin. Chaplin said, "A man steps into a manhole. That is slapstick. But a man steps over a manhole and gets hit by a bus. Makes you laugh a little. Why? In the attempt to get to safety, he gets killed. In the attempt to accomplish something, he accomplishes the opposite." That's comic irony. And you see it on the macro level with a plot. Let's go out and make $1,000. And we lose 10,000. That's a comic plot. When you try to make a statement to impress people and you make a jackass out of yourself, that's comic irony. Just making a jackass out of yourself isn't as funny without the intention to do the opposite. So you'll find that element within comic moments. There are other comic elements. The absurd image was a term I began to use for a comic element. If you think about a guy in a mariachi band, right? What's the funniest guy in the mariachi band would be like a little tiny guy with a giant guitar, or a giant guy with like a tiny guitar, right? Reversals of scale are kind of intrinsically funny. And if you look at cartoons and ones that are funny, often things that are big are small and things that are small are big. There is such a thing as an absurd image, and that visual element can goose a joke. Finally, you have stuff like wordplay, puns. Puns are a comic element, but in truth, you're almost never going to hear a pun that makes you laugh. Try to find one that makes you laugh. Puns don't do it unless that pun is part of a punchline that has other elements in it. Now let me give you an example of what I'm talking about in terms of stacking layers of joke element within one punchline. Where it really hit me was one day I was reading The Far Side and I saw this cartoon and it all became clear to me. All right, so the cartoon begins with, it's one panel and it's just, it's a baby lying with its arms outstretched on the ground, and there are two little airplane pilots sitting on its neck. It's kind of a comic image. There's another baby flying through the air and two little pilots on its neck. Reversal of scale, absurd image. We're not laughing yet, but it's in the comic area. Here's the caption. The pilot is saying, "Engines, check. Lights, check. All right, let's get this baby off the ground." It's a little laugh. What happened? One, there's a contrast between the voice, very serious, very authoritative, up here, and the absurdity of what he's saying. So there's a contrast right there. In the attempt to sound like I'm an authority, I end up sounding like a bit of an idiot. That's major to the comedy. And then finally, there's a pun. There's a pun on baby. Let's get this baby off the ground. That's the catalyst that makes you laugh. And so if you look at it, you'll find you stack them up like that, and you end up getting the laugh. That was the secret that I took to joke writing at The Simpsons. Take it on with you as you go forward in your careers. That concludes Brent Forrester, TV Writing Stories Part 1. Thank you for listening. If you stick around for Part 2, I'll take you through King of the Hill, where one of the great story writers of all time in TV, in my opinion, Greg Daniels, collaborates with Mike Judge, who, believe it or not, may be a sort of modern Leonardo in terms of his God-given talent disguised beneath a kind of aw shucks delivery. King of the Hill, I then went to a period of writing screenplays, which I'll tell you the insights I got there. I wrote about 25 feature screenplays and learned a lot about how to sell and write those. And then The Office, where I learned all the lessons that you can learn there. And then I'm on Apatow now, so there's other stuff to be discovered as we go forward in the land of Apatow.